Many of our viewers live in secular countries and it's really hard. It's a challenge to share the gospel. Well, this is the question that I put to Pastor Shawn Brace, our special guest today. He's the author of the book, The Table I Long For. He's a minister, new church planter. And I asked him, how do we share the gospel when we live in a secular society? Pastor, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Tim, for having me.
How do we engage with secular people? The challenge we've got here in Australia is that it's a secular society. The church is struggling to grow. And yet, if I look at some of the other parts of the South Pacific, Papua New Guinea, the Holy Spirit's been poured out. The church is growing rapidly.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that presses on my mind a lot. The United States is not as secular as Australia, but I happen to live and minister in the most secular part of the United States. So it's something that troubles me, or I don't know if it troubles me, but it challenges me and it actually excites me. So I talk, I've written on this very question, how to engage the secular mind and heart. And I highlight a number of things, and it's about shifts in our thinking rather than methods, I think. Um, one of them is from come to go, or from attraction to mission, where instead of waiting for people to come to us or putting on programs where we are trying to get them to come to us, we are going out to them and we are trying to meet them where they are in their contexts and in their, spheres. So that's one shift in my mind. Another one is from programs to people, where we, I think, need to think less in terms of programs and putting on events and more in terms of, again, engaging people and pursuing life with them and trying to inhabit their spaces and just mingle with them and be with them in their contexts. I also talk about how I think we need to shift from dogmatism to humility. One of the big turnoffs, I think, that a lot of secular people experience is when religious people come in and they act like they have all the answers. And, they come with a spirit of dogmatism and, overzealousness. And, unfortunately, throughout the history of Christianity, there has been a lot of Christians who have moved with great zeal, but the fruit of their lives has not, warranted that zeal because there's been a lot of persecution that has been um, levied by the church throughout Christian history. There's been various inquisitions and so forth, and we don't have to go through through all the litany of events in church history. But secular people are very suspicious of Christians who come in with seemingly speaking in the name of God, but not acting according to the ways of God, as I would describe it. So we need to come with more humility. We can still, share our convictions, but doing so in a way that doesn't seem like we think we have it all figured out. So those are three very brief shifts
Hmm,
in our thinking that I would mention. And of course, I'd be
right.
happy to kind of drill down more on those if you
Yeah.
are interested. But yeah.
And look, let's start with the first one where you talked about from come to go. And
Mhm.
perhaps a traditional model is that we think of a great program, we get a good speaker, we do
Mhm.
some sort of prophecy series or whatever it might be. We letterbox, we market it, and then wait to see who turns up. Pray about it, of course.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's a different way to do things than expecting people to come
Yeah,
to us.
I certainly don't want to diminish the significance of and many times the success of that type of approach. There are still many people who will respond to that approach. Part of my concern there, though, is, there's an old expression, even if we do draw people, that what you win them with is what you win them to. And so if we're winning them with a meeting, then we're winning them to a meeting, so to speak. And so life will be thought of as a series of going to events and meetings and programs,
Sure.
which, again, there's, I think, some value in that. But what we're trying to do, or at least I'm trying to do, is is not only draw people into faith, but hopefully draw them into an ongoing experience with Jesus such that they will become more and more like Jesus. And Jesus didn't simply go to meetings, right? He brought his message of healing and love and grace. So yeah, but even still, even the limited value that it might have, I just don't see that there is a large mass of secular people, and of course, maybe we need to define what we mean by secular, but I just don't see a lot of secular people showing up to Christian meetings. There's a lot of skepticism, so
Mm.
we're gonna have a hard time even getting them through the door. And I've had conversations with people who say, well, this speaker, this particular speaker is very, very, gospel centered and they're focused on Jesus. And it's not like the old traditional, prophecy meetings that are all about the beasts and scary images and so forth. And I say that's wonderful. That's great. But just the whole idea of it altogether is probably going to be challenging for people who would rather come and have conversations than being talked at. So that's
Yeah.
part of it as well.
And that just reminds me of one thing you were saying in your book, and I've just got this marked. It was
Hmm.
talking about Jesus pursued his mission of seeking and saving the lost, giving his life as a ransom. And it was through sitting at a table with people,
Hmm.
eating and drinking. And the idea here is that he ate meals, so the ministry of Jesus, meals were enacted, there's grace, community, mission. These were achieved just by sitting and eating and fellowshipping with people
Yeah.
rather than necessarily the formal idea of standing behind a pulpit and preaching to them. Can you
Yeah.
just expand on that a little bit more about, so, and sure, Jesus did teach and he did preach, but we see Jesus eating and fellowshipping a lot. How do we emulate that then in this modern age?
Yeah, so I actually just revisited this idea recently, both in my preaching and then in a weekly newsletter I send out. One scholar has pointed out that in the book of Luke, for example, Jesus basically throughout the whole book is either going to a meal, he's at a meal, or he's coming from a meal. And so it was just like it was such a integral part of his ministry and his life. So I mean, it's just as simple as inviting our neighbors over for a meal. It's as simple as inviting a neighbor to go out to eat. Um, just recently for us, my wife and I, we've recently moved to the city of Portland, Maine, not Portland, Oregon. Many people think of that, but Portland, Maine is the original Portland here in the US. It happens to be, by some measures, actually the most post-Christian city in America. But so we just recently moved here. We are starting a new church or a new gospel community, and so we've been here for about 4 months, and we finally wanted to put on like an open house, and so we had a we set up an open house to invite our neighbors, and a couple of Saturday nights ago, we invited them in. We had some food, we had some drinks, and we just, about 25 or 30 people came, and it was interesting because my wife and I were worried that our space wouldn't be big enough um, to invite people in. But what we noticed is that at any one time, there was probably at the most maybe 15 to 20 here at one time at the highest, and then some slipped out and some left and came in and so forth. But all of us were just huddled around our kitchen island. And there was a whole rest of like our living room. If I didn't have the blur on here, you could see behind me. The whole rest of the living room was just completely empty. And we were just all huddled around the kitchen island, 2 or 3 feet apart. And we were just in, conversation and enjoying fellowship. And so we had a great, great, great time. And then one of our neighbors who came, she invited us subsequently to what, I don't know, in Australia, if you guys have anything that resembles our Thanksgiving here in the US, but Thanksgiving's a huge, huge holiday here, and it just happened here in America. And people are starting to do something called Friendsgiving, where they instead of having maybe before or after Thanksgiving, they'll invite their friends over for a meal. Whereas they spend the actual day with their family and so forth. So one of our other neighbors invited us to a Friendsgiving at their house. And so we went to that about 6 days later. And again, there was like probably 25 or 30 people, and almost all of us were just huddled around their kitchen island, chatting, talking. I was probably like this far from one of the guys I was talking with, and I said, you know what? We've come a long way since COVID when we were, experiencing social distancing. And
Yeah.
I realized that the idea of social distancing was always doomed for failure because human beings need connection. We need to be in close proximity to other human beings. We're actually designed, I believe, to need that physical proximity. And again, it was just we were visiting, we were conversing, we were I would call it fellowshipping, probably most of the people there, many of whom were probably fairly secular, wouldn't necessarily call it that. But this is what Jesus did. This is the bulk of his ministry. He accepted invitations to parties over and over and over again, so much so that he was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. This was the reputation that Jesus, not that I think he was a glutton or a drunkard, but he was just he would show up at parties so much that people accused him of being that way. And so it's an organic, informal time to connect with people, and we are inevitably nudging them, I believe, closer to God's heart. And the fact that they are in our presence in some ways, Jesus says in Luke chapter 10 that if they receive you, they are receiving me. So when people embrace us, they are in some ways, if we are filled with God's Spirit, they are some ways receiving Jesus. And the more that they're hanging out with us means the more they're hanging out with Jesus. And yes, there will be time for explicit, conversation about the Bible and about Jesus and so forth. But even the simple fact that they are accepting us into their fellowship, I believe, is an indication that they are opening themselves up more and more to the truth about who Jesus is.
And I like that idea that I've read you write, where you talk about just be intentional about inviting people into your everyday routines, into your everyday life, you know,
Hmm.
and getting together and having meals together is just part of the routine of life and socializing.
That's
What
right.
about this question? The research I've been part of has identified, though, the fear of burning bridges, destroying
Mm.
friendships, being too pushy, being perceived to be like, and so how do you encourage people to navigate that sort of space or overcome that sort of fear? So, invite your friends around,
Mhm.
hear their stories, fellowship with them.
Mhm.
But how do you solve this dilemma that some people have got, this fear of, oh, I don't want to come on too strong,
Yeah.
and I don't want to miss this opportunity. I want to share my faith, but if I do it wrong, I'm going to destroy my friendship with this person.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to candidly admit, Tim, that this is a tension that I have not solved. I think to some degree that tension will always exist, and maybe we have to be fine with that tension. I probably have historically erred on the side of caution, in the sense that I would rather be too late, so to speak, than too early. Um, I take great comfort as I share throughout, that book that, you know, God, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, they are ultimately the disciplers of people. And thankfully, God does not place anyone's salvation in my very mortal hands. There's different Christian communities have different theologies of evangelism and salvation. Many denominations and non-denominations maintain that unless a person explicitly accepts Jesus, there's no chance they will be saved. You and I come from a particular community of faith where we actually do not have that theology. We maintain, historically have maintained, at least I do, maybe you do as well, that there will be many people who are ultimately saved who maybe have never even heard the name Jesus. That's not to propose some sort of universalism that everyone's just going to be saved, and of course, it raises a lot of questions about what's the point of it all if, people can be saved without ever explicitly acknowledging Jesus. And that's a whole other conversation that we can have, of course. But the point is that gives me some comfort, and it takes the pressure off me to think that I have to seal the deal all the time. Um, so, with that being said, I am trying to listen for the Spirit and just see how the Spirit is already working in someone's life. And ideally, um, and this doesn't always happen, but ideally, people will, themselves initiate that sort of conversation or indicate themselves that, hey, I'm curious to hear more about your faith. And it can just come up naturally, organically. Um, you know, you were just mentioning how we can take everyday rhythms and everyday things that we do and just invite people to share those with us. One of the things that I've done a lot is, when I go running, I'll just try to, as much as I can, go with other people and just use that as an opportunity to share a life. And I have one of my new neighbors here in my community. We've committed to going running every Friday morning together, and the time that he can do it is 5:30 a.m. So it's pushing me a little bit. But I've committed to that, and it's a great time. And we've already had number of gospel conversations where they just kind of naturally come up. He knows I'm a pastor, and he's not at all intimidated by that. But just in the course of conversation, like recently we were talking about anxiety, and I just and I'm not trying to like force it into the conversation. I'm not trying to figure out a way to bring the discussion around to it. But just in the course of a conversation about anxiety, I just, shared with him how I oftentimes can overcome anxiety, and it's because of the gospel. It's because of my security in Jesus. And so I just drop it in there, and it's true to what my experience is. So it doesn't have to be awkward or forced or whatever. It's just who I am, so it's going to come out.
It's interesting. I've got a little garden at the front of my place, and I had a big pile of mulch there to distribute through my garden just to keep the weeds down and stuff like that. So I was out the front of my place digging this big pile of mulch into a wheelbarrow and lugging it
Hmm.
away. And it was just interesting to be there on the street and accessible to the neighbors who are walking their
Hmm.
dogs, going for a
Hmm.
stroll, and had so many wonderful conversations with people because it was
Hmm.
neutral ground, and we were engaging and talking, and it was amazing just to start to form friendships that way when I first moved into this house that I'm in now. But even some of the questions that asked me, what do I do, and
Hmm.
and sometimes I'd ask even deeper questions. It was just wonderful to have those opportunities without me being forceful, that the door
Hmm.
would be opened, and different conversations were engaged. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important, I'm such a huge advocate of a simple kind of quote ministry of presence. That's why I'm so huge on neighborhood um, missional living. My wife and I, where we moved, it's a whole story, which I can see God's fingerprints all over it, how we moved into the house that we did. And I don't know if you use this term in Australia, but it's a new development. So it's like a bunch of new houses. So
Sure.
there's probably close to 50 houses now in this little kind of uh, separated neighborhood, and there's more houses that continue to go up. But we just like I view this neighborhood as my parish, if you will, in the sense that like I'm just so singularly focused on it. And so I just have such a heart for my neighbors. And again, just, if some of them were listening to this right now, they maybe think, okay, what is he up to? But it's just, I feel like God has called me to steward the neighborhood and to bless the neighborhood and to like just serve as like a chaplain, if you will, where I'm just here and available for people and their spiritual, social, emotional needs. So my wife and I, every night, almost every night when we're home, we just our neighborhood is a circle. So every night at like 8:30, not because we're trying to necessarily, be evangelistic in our efforts, but we just go for a walk and we just walk the neighborhood, and the
Yep.
neighborhood has street lights, so it's like plenty of light. And we'll take like at least 3 or 4 loops around our neighborhood. And, we do that sometimes multiple times a day. And there's lots of people who walk their dogs and so forth. But it's just like inevitably, we almost always have some good conversations with our neighbors, many of whom we now know. But yeah, the more you can just be seen, the more people just get used to you, and you build trust and confidence and goodwill just by being seen. And just by knowing that you're there and you're normal, quote unquote, and you are trustworthy, and you're building relational trust with people. One of our neighbors, the first time that I kind of had a deeper discussion with her, because like you, that question always comes up, what do you do? And we had interacted with this one neighbor probably um, 3 or 4 times prior to this conversation, but she finally asked me, well, what is it that you do? And when I told her I was a pastor, she just started laughing. And I never had that response before. And she goes, I'm so sorry. She goes, but that just totally tracks. And I said, what do you mean? She's like, you and your wife and kids, you just give off a wholesome vibe. Like you hadn't seen us very much. Um, we hadn't interacted with her a lot, but she was just like, yeah, that tracks. You guys give off this certain vibe. Well, it turns out that she herself was the daughter of a pastor. Um, but she has since like kind of deconstructed her faith and is now like a very progressive Christian, I guess you could call it. But since then, by the way, we've become very, very, very good friends with her. And they invited us over to their house for dinner, and they came to our open house and so forth. But again, just being present has a way of like building trust and confidence in people just by seeing you repeatedly, not even doing or saying anything, just seeing you.
And you talk about the table I long for. Can you
Mm,
explain what you mean by the table? So we've been talking about eating, fellowshipping, socializing, living life with people. But can
mm.
you just explain a little bit more about what do you mean by this metaphor or this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, like I say in the book, I view it not only as a metaphor, but really as a true, reflection of and representation. I mean, not even representation, but the place where life and ministry and all the Jesus stuff really takes place. So the term "the table I long for" is taken from a reading that a friend of mine sent to me, where it was a particular Christian writer was reflecting on the type of experience he longed to have, in the church, so to speak, where we're kind of all sitting at the table together, and we are experiencing mutual care, mutual interest. We're sharing life, we're sharing our stories with one another. And for me, there is a physiological power to eating together. There's something that actually takes place physiologically that kind of binds us to one another. So it does a type of work that goes beyond mere logic. You know, it's not like simply because we're talking to each other, um, we are making those connections, but just again, being in the presence of one another at a table, sitting together, um, eating food triggers certain, triggers dopamine, in ourselves so that we're kind of bonded to one another. So sitting at the table, triggers those sorts of things. It binds us together. I love the fact as well that sitting at a table together is inevitably, implicitly a sort of egalitarian experience, right? In the sense that we're all sitting on the same level. We're all, no one is standing over someone else, like you do in a sermon, for example. There's one person standing over other people, so to
Sure.
speak. But at the table, we're just all on the same equal level. Um, there is ideally equal give and take. We are exploring, life and faith together mutually. We're having conversation. Obviously, there's many times where one person or two persons can dominate a conversation and you have all those dynamics. But I think at its best, when we're sitting at the table, we are exploring ideas and faith and each other's stories together mutually. So that's what I think of when I think of sitting at the table together. Just all the good things that come with that.
I really miss the fellowship and sense of community I had with my church before COVID. And so
Mm,
the way our church program was structured is there's a Bible study time to begin with. We'd break
mhm,
into small groups, we'd study together, and then there's a sermon, a traditional sermon afterwards. And I used to find that particularly that Bible study time was such a blessing to me because,
mm,
we'd study the scripture, we'd share our perspectives of things that we'd learned during the week, but we'd also talk about experiences, the struggles. We'd had children at similar ages and the challenges with work and stuff like that. There's such good fellowship. But of course, COVID disrupted that. And then when church resumed, it's not quite rebuilt the same way. Not all the classes have been run and the groups, but I really miss that sense of community. And whilst it's not sitting around a physical table, but we had that similar fellowship that you might have when you're eating together and communing and sharing life experiences and encouraging each other and sharing pain. So, that I long for that experience myself. Um,
yeah. Yeah. That's why, I talk about, and this is not original to me, but, I think church ideally, however, whatever we mean by church, um, should be thought of more in terms of circles than rows, right? Like we are looking at each other, not just staring at the back of each other's heads, because that communicates implicitly, among other things, that we are in fellowship with one another. We're not just sitting in a program where we are being talked at, and we are being taught. There's a place for that, I think, but it's more a community experience.
and so just before I ask you about programs to people,
Mhm.
what advice could you give to somebody who says, well, I can't invite anyone to my church because we're just not friendly. You know,
Mm, mhm.
we just don't get along with each other, and so I just don't tell anyone about church, or I don't bring anyone to church because it's just not a great place to be. I don't
Mhm.
know. Do you have any advice for someone in that
Yeah, I can
situation?
I can identify with that so much actually. I know it sounds alarming for a pastor to say that. I wouldn't necessarily say I feel that way now about current my current congregation, or the one I recently moved away from. Um, Although I will say that just in general, as I kind of mentioned before, I'm not sure that a church program is what a lot of people are looking for. Anyway, there will be people who are, but I think people are more looking to be invited into life with us, and they'd probably rather sit at our our kitchen table than sit in a pew in a church. But so I mean that's kind of the direction I would go either way, is just think more in terms of inviting people into your life rather
Okay.
than do a program or your church. Because you know there there's it's a lot less threatening to people to just I mean, I will say, with this being said, Tim, let me just kind of balance this a little bit. I do still also think, however, that there are some people um, who are secular who might feel threatened by being invited into your living room.
Okay.
It's too personal. It's too
Sure.
intimate. um, where they would be open to perhaps being sort of like a nameless face in the crowd at a church service. So,
Sure.
so there's that tension, and I think that's why we need to be in tune with the spirit, to know where people are coming from, and to understand how the human psyche works, and um, just where a person is coming from. So it's not a one size fits all. But with that being said, uh, if you have a part of a church where it's not only not friendly, but it's toxic, or the topics or emphases that the church has doesn't point to Jesus, um, I'm not sure that I would invite people into that experience no matter what.
And so what I hear you talk about though is so it's it's not about the programs. People
Mhm.
desire connection. They desire to be part of a community. They desire relationships. And so,
Mhm.
fulfill that in any way that you can.
Yeah.
And and it's interesting, I've seen you talk about it's not the church buildings that
Hmm.
get people to come along. And I'm seeing that happening throughout Papua New Guinea, where they might not
Mm.
have fancy church buildings. In fact, often they're meeting in their homes, in the garden, small
Mhm.
groups, wherever they can. And the church
Hmm.
is just growing rapidly in that tight,
Mm.
small communities where they study the Bible together. They have great sense of community. So it's not about the church building. It's not about the program, but it's that
Hmm.
sense of community of studying the word together and
Yeah,
praying.
I think that's right, because we see rapid growth in, what is, I think a lot of people refer to now as the global South, which is, places like Papua New Guinea and South America and Africa and so forth. And people will say, well, that's because in many ways those societies are pre-modern in their thinking, and they're more open to, traditional evangelism and so forth. And I think there's something to that. But I also, what we don't recognize probably is that these societies are heavily predicated on, like you say, community. When you go to church, for example, it's an all-day event, right? You are there all day long, and you are fostering a spirit of connection and community and family. And so that principle is still there, where it's a very, very connected society, and it's a very, very connected church experience where you are really in it with other people. And so that idea that you're just talking about, I do believe also crosses over into our Western quote unquote secular society. Now there is a tension there, because I think the tension is where a lot of people in secular Western society probably do want more relational approaches to faith. There's also a fair amount of, I don't know how to put it, like relational distance, because people have been hurt and damaged and, experienced different types of abuse. And there's a high level of suspicion relationally, that people have about each other. So on the one hand, I think there's a longing for community, for relationship, for connection, but there's also a high level of suspicion and distance that is present that might require a lot of um, patient labor, so to speak. So there's that tension that we have to recognize that even though people do long for community, it might take a while for them to trust you enough to step into it.
Sure. Okay, so you're talking about then it's a change of thinking
Hmm.
from inviting people to come to you, to go to them. Jesus said go. So the idea
Hmm.
is to go and meet with people, engage with them. You're
Hmm.
talking about instead of programs being the focus, the thing that's attracting people, it's the relationships, the community, the connection. And then
Hmm.
you mentioned a third one. Just share a little bit more about that, about humility or dogmatism. Just explain what that's all
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, so there's different ways that I have tried to articulate this distinction. I recently did a presentation on this that I chose to kind of articulate this in a different way, and I'm trying to remember the way I phrased it in this recent presentation. Maybe I'll look it up here in a second. But one of the pivotal moments for me was actually I shared a book I had written with a friend of mine who would have probably called himself an agnostic. He's kind of waffles in and out of that still today, I would say, although he kind of wants to believe. He still has lots of doubts and questions and so forth. And as a side note, I think every honest Christian should admit that we all, hopefully, I think it's appropriate, have, wrestle with questions because we don't know everything. Like God is huge
Yeah, yeah.
and his knowledge is infinite, and so we hopefully don't feel like we have him all figured out. But I shared a book with him that I had written, not this most recent one, but one or two books before that. I don't remember which book it was in particular. And after he read it, I asked him, I said, "Hey, what'd you think of the book?" And he goes, "Well, it was good," he said, "but you wrote with too much certainty." And I thought, well, I wonder what he means by that. But he went on to explain it that, yeah, you wrote as though you had it all figured out, that you knew all the answers and there was no doubt in your mind that you were right. And you didn't give um, a lot of room for pushback or questions or whatever. And so that was kind of maybe a starting point of my recognition that um, there's a bit of repulsiveness to people who feel like they have it all figured out. And
Mm.
as I tell people, just putting it in children's terms, like nobody likes a know-it-all. Like we don't we're like repulsed by that. Um, and I've noticed that I've felt an aversion to and been pushed away from other Christians who speak with certainty about their faith that I disagree with. So I remember one conversation I was having, extended conversation about, I don't know, 15 years ago with a couple of guys who were a part of a particular evangelical denomination. I won't mention what it is, but they were interacting with me with so much certainty that my particular faith was apostate, that it was like we were not even Christians basically. And that was a huge turnoff to me. And it was like you are you are participating in this conversation like you are the final authority on this topic, and you knew exactly who we were and what we believed. And I was like, it was a huge turnoff. And so I realized that if I am pushed away by that attitude, why wouldn't other people be similarly turned off by my attitude if I come across that way? Um, and so, as I mentioned before, I think that, you know, secular people already come with a bias against Christians in many ways, and then all the more so if we come across as seeming like we have it figured all out. So that's kind of what I'm getting at there.
Pastor Shawn, just before we finish, is there any final words to recap or to encourage the viewer who wants to be effective in their discipleship? They want to live the life that Jesus lived, and and being loving and sharing and building community. Uh,
Yeah.
what final advice can you give?
Well, this might be late in the game, but I want to throw one other shift in our thinking, if I
Great,
could.
love it.
As I was looking back at my recent presentation, I realized that I added a fourth into there. And so not to like prolong our discussion in the interest of time, but I just want to encourage people to think one other shift as from propositional to demonstrational. And by that, I mean recognizing that the way we live is the theology we give. In other words,
That's
um, people will read our lives long before they'll ever read scripture or the Bible. And so we often think in terms of arguments and ways to convince people of the truth and so forth. And again, there is such a critical place for giving people good, solid reasons for, embracing Jesus and coming into truth. But ultimately, a life that is well lived is far more impactful than any argument we can make. One of a particular author that I enjoy reading, Ellen White, she talks about how the greatest argument in favor of the gospel is a loving and lovable Christian. And so, the way we live is an incredible testimony to the power of God. And so, that kind of encompasses most of what I'm talking about here, actually, in the sense that living life in a way that reflects the love of God is going to be the single most important thing we do when it comes to being followers of Jesus and trying to invite others to be followers of Jesus. Is instead of thinking in terms of programs and arguments and buildings, think about us being the temple of God. We are the temple of God, and people, as we allow the Spirit to dwell within our temple, so to speak, people will be drawn to that and they will be impressed with the power of God through the lives that we are living.
fantastic. Thank you so much, Pastor Shawn Brace. Really appreciate your wisdom and sharing your experience with us today. May God bless you with your church plant, and we look forward to future books that you might put out on this topic.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Tim.